Hi, my name is Mary Kate Pensabene. Today is June 6th, 2022, and I'll be presenting on the anatomy and physiology of the retina. Today we'll be talking about the anatomy and the basic physical structure of the retina and talking about the physiology of how the retina processes the input of light. So just for a general overview, what is the retina? It's the innermost of the three coats of the eye. It's responsible for converting relevant information from the external environment, most frequently in the form of light photons, into neural impulses for transmission to the brain. The retinal layer contains photoreceptors that convert light energy into these electrical signals. There are three basic layers of the retina. The first is the photoreceptor layer, which we'll break down a little bit later, then the bipolar layer, and then the ganglion layer. So just for a picture of the gross anatomy here, you can see on this upper left corner of the photo a picture of the eye as a whole, and then zoomed in on the back right corner of the eye is the layers of the retina. So the light is portrayed as being transmitted from the top here, but really light is first kind of recorded and transmitted through the back of the eye, so through the sclera and choroid region, which is attached to the pigment epithelium. The pigment epithelium then branches off into layers of rods and cones that are sort of interspersed between one another. You can see a cone here in between a few rods. Following the rod and cone layer is the general layer of the bipolar cells, which is first kind of intertwined between some horizontal cells, as you can see in this photo. That moves through the bipolar cell layer into the ganglion cell layer, which is bridged by amacrine cells. And then after the ganglion cells, the fibers exit towards the optic nerve, which will help for transmission to the brain and will help portray some of the input and the light and the picture that is portrayed through the eye to the brain for processing. So the first layer that we talked about is the photoreceptor cell layer. The function of this layer is to convert the photon light stimulus, the initial stimulus of light, into an electrical signal for transduction through the eye. The photoreceptor layer contains rods and cones, and rods contribute to nighttime or dark vision, like the absence of vision in the dark, and the cones contribute to daytime vision. We next move into the bipolar cell layer. This cell layer functions to convey gradients between photoreceptors and the ganglion layer. So between the rods and cones into the next ganglion layer, which will eventually lead to the optic nerve and to the brain. Glutamate released on these bipolar cells hyperpolarizes the cell, and this functions to inhibit the propagation of the signal onto the ganglion cells. And we'll break that down a little bit more when we move into the physiology of the retina. Horizontal cells are mixed in with this layer, like shown in this photo, in between the bipolar cells, and the horizontal cells introduce lateral inhibition in the dendrites, so they move side to side. There are also amacrine cells in this layer oftentimes. Sometimes amacrine cells function in the ganglion layer, sometimes amacrine cells function in the bipolar layer. As you can see up here, the amacrine cells are kind of at the bridge between the bipolar and the ganglion cells. And these amacrine cells also introduce lateral inhibition, but this time to the axon terminal. Next, moving into the ganglion cell layer, this is the final output of the neurons into the vertebrate retina. This layer collects information about the visual world and passes it through to the optic nerve. This is sort of the last layer of the retina before the passage of the impulse goes to the optic nerve and to the brain. This layer can sometimes contain displaced amacrine cells. Like I said, those amacrine cells are sometimes found in the ganglion cell layer, sometimes in the bipolar layer. Here's another photo of just the breakdown of the layers of the retina as we move into the physiology. At the bottom, we see this pigment epithelium and the rods and cones in the photoreceptor layer. We move into the bipolar, you see the bipolar neurons here, and then the ganglion cell, and then as they kind of bridge into the optic nerve. This photo doesn't show the horizontal and the amacrine cells, but we can believe that they're interspersed in both the bipolar and the ganglion layer. So next we're going to move into some of the physiology of the retina and what the pathway looks like for light transduction. A light photon interacts with a photoreceptor cell first. So the photoreceptor cells respond to the input of a light proton, light photon, I correct myself. This induces a conformational change in the retina from its cis form to its linear isomer. So this happens in that photoreceptor cell layer. The conformational change activates something called rhodopsin, which triggers a cascade of sodium channels to close in the membrane of the photoreceptor cells, and this hyperpolarizes the receptors. So the hyperpolarization of the receptors will then further inhibit the release of something called glutamate on the bipolar cells. In the inhibition of the release of glutamate, the bipolar cells will remain uninhibited and will remain on. So the bipolar cells will remain active and they'll stimulate the ganglion cells. And this sends action potentials along the axon. And this will be propagated through the ganglion layer and will leave the eye via the optic nerve. So kind of to go over that again in more simple terms, the light photon first interacts with the photoreceptor cell layer. A conformational change occurs in this layer, which activates the rhodopsin, the sodium channels close, and the cell is hyperpolarized. Glutamate is released on the bipolar cells, and they're inhibited, which means that they remain active, and they stimulate the ganglion cell layer. The action potential propagates along the axon and exits the eye via the optic nerve. So that overall is a breakdown of the anatomy and the physiology of the retina. There are obviously lots more to this, and it is a very complicated part of the eye with lots of potential for interacting with a stimulus from the outside world and transmitting that through to the brain. It's a key part of sensory reception in the body, and I hope this has been helpful. Here are my sources. Thank you.